It's great to be here, and thank you, Willem, for putting this together. The stars have aligned, and yeah,
right.
it's great to be here. So, yeah, today I'm just going to be presenting this continental scale groundwater model, which is the whole eastern third of the continental Australia. And this is a paper that we published in Scientific Reports. These are the co-authors on the paper, and Willem was an integral role in producing this paper. So a bit of motivation, firstly, for why we would consider continental scale models. Well, firstly, yeah, we consider the whole of the basin. So we're not just focused in on one regional area. We're kind of zooming out. So we have like a very large area to look at. And the advantage of doing this is that we don't have to impose any boundary conditions along the side walls of the model. So we don't have to, estimate or guesstimate what the fluxes in and out of the box are. We kind of treat the whole system as a whole. And this also integrates some regional geological complexity. And from this, we can simulate the groundwater flow field continuously across the whole basin. And we're also able to simulate the residence times. And we're particularly good at resolving groundwater flow in deep aquifers. So the shallow aquifers are a little bit less well constrained in our model, but because we can resolve the whole of the basin, we can actually look at the residence times of some of the very, very deep aquifers. There are some caveats to this, though. Firstly, there's some local geological structures that may impact groundwater flow which aren't resolved within our model. So like small-scale faults, where which might act as conduits for fluid flow to the surface. Also, we would expect quite a bit of misfit to hydrological data. If we treat the basin at such a large scale, we're never going to be able to fit the data perfectly everywhere. And we cannot really resolve reliably the alluvial sediments that operate on very short timescales. And so, yeah, we're kind of geodynamicists working in large-scale groundwater flow problems. So for the hydrogeologists in this room and online, please be gentle. So our approach was to take a sophisticated parallel code that is highly scalable and relatively easy to use. So all the notebooks, when I say notebooks, these are Jupyter notebooks on the right here, all the documentation and all the groundwater flow models that we produce are in fairly accessible repositories, so they're online. And you can run through these notebooks and see how the solvers operate and really just get into these groundwater flow problems pretty quickly. So these all leverage a Jupyter Notebook environment. We use Python as our programming interface. And this is quite useful because we can share documentation as we go. We can write workflows, which we can share with colleagues. And we can also use the outputs of these notebooks to deploy on high-performance computing infrastructures. So we ran our groundwater flow models on NCI Gunnedah, and it scales up to, well, we scaled it up to, I think, 1,000 CPU cores. So yeah, it's pretty good. So this is our study area. So the opaque regions indicate the extent of our numerical model. And what we have is a whole bunch of different data that we can throw at this problem to constrain groundwater flow velocities in the aquifers. So we have borehole temperature data, recharge estimates from the chloride mass balance method, and we have hydraulic pressure measured in wells at various sites throughout this basin. We also have a 3D geological model, which contains the description of all the different aquifers within this basin. And we can populate those with hydraulic conductivities, which we use to infer the groundwater flow velocities once we solve for the hydraulic pressure. But yeah, what we want is the groundwater flow velocities in each aquifer. So this is kind of a very crude cartoon of our model setup. So basically we have a mesh, which is a deformable mesh. And this is just a box, right? It's a box. And each node is, we have like high resolution distribution of nodes within our box. And we assign an upper boundary condition, lower boundary conditions, and side boundary conditions, all right? And then within this box, we solve a numerical equation. This is just the groundwater flow equation in steady state initially. And we can also, because the constitutive equations that control groundwater flow are actually very similar to the heat equation, we kind of get the temperature out as well, kind of for free. So we can solve for temperature and groundwater simultaneously. And this is just like a 3D kind of schematic of all the different aquifers and aquithards in the basin on the bottom right there. Yeah, and so this is Underworld 2. This is developed by Louis Moresi in the ANU, and it's a particle and cell finite element code for geodynamics. So it supports deformable meshes, highly scalable, and everything's written in Python. And now, so when I sort of set up our problem, I kind of mentioned there was multiple data sets that we want to try and assimilate within our model. And so the way that we decided to approach this was to assimilate our data within a Bayesian framework. So Bayes' theorem formally describes the link between observations, priors, and the model output. And where these intersect is called the posterior. So we have our prior information in blue, data in orange, and the model in green. And the posterior is that black region where those three quantities intersect. And so this is an example of a well post problem where they actually intersect appropriately. And sometimes you won't have a well post problem. You'll have the data in your model and your prior information telling you different things. And so you don't actually get an intersection between those three quantities. And your posterior is awkward. It's ill-posed. So yeah, sampling the posterior provides an ensemble of plausible models, not just a single deterministic model of groundwater flow. So we can, with a large enough ensemble, we can start to appraise the uncertainties on these groundwater flow velocities and the hydraulic conductivity. Yeah, and so basically how this works is that we have M, our model parameters, and this is mostly hydraulic conductivity. We propagate that within our model, which describes the geometric variations of all the different aquifers and aquithards within the model. We solve for the groundwater flow velocity, and then we compare the velocity field with our observations at the surface. So this is hydraulic pressure, recharge estimates, and also temperature gradients, boreholes. And so what we do is essentially repeat this process again and again and again until we get better and better fits to our observations that we're trying to fit. And so, yes, this on the right here is basically describing a function, which is our misfit function. And this is essentially, you want a lower misfit means that there's less misfit between your observations and your model output. So you want to try and find the lowest misfit to get the optimal model. So that's the optimal trade-off between your data, your priors, and your likelihood function. But just saturating this, sampling this misfit essentially gives you an idea of how much variation there is within your model space. And so the problem with this is that you might actually find instances sampling this function, you might find that you're in a local minimum. So if you start sampling it even more. Yeah, so this is you might get trapped in a local minimum here, or you might get in a local maximum here. But what to find the optimal model is essentially this global minimum here. And so if you don't sample very well, you might not actually end up finding that global minimum. You might just find this local minimum. And so the trick here is to basically sample more. So we just add more points here along our misfit function. And then, we're essentially sampling the posterior a whole lot better. Okay. And the way we do this is using a Markov chain Monte Carlo technique, which is like a random walk. So you start off with one solution, and then eventually kind of using a Markov chain, you step towards a better and a better solution. And so then after, a certain saturation point, depending on how many dimensions your number of variables are, you kind of saturate the posterior, and we can stop, which is good. And just a side note here, we use a Latin hypercube to initiate our first guesses. So this kind of ensures that we have orthogonality within our initial parameter space. Yes, and then there's also the problem of non-uniqueness. So there might not be one single groundwater flow model, but there might be multiple models that reproduce our data equally well. And so a good analogy for this, which I probably don't have to talk to you guys about because you understand this so well, is that you might have a screen here, and here's a person here looking at the screen, and they're basically looking at the shadow cast by an object. So here's a torch shining onto an object, and it's casting a shadow, and it's like charades, yeah? So there might be multiple different objects that's in front of this torch, which actually produces the same shadow, but the person standing here looking at the screen would have no idea of the configuration of different geometries here. And so, many solutions may fit the same observations, but there's definitely some qualitative ways we can tell that some solutions may be better than others. So for instance, here on the right is a great example of overfitting. So you've got these, all these kind of two clusters of data, really. There's one cluster here of the yellow data and one cluster here of the blue data. And this algorithm has tried to produce a line that fits equally between all of them. It hasn't done a really, it's got a very low misfit, but it looks like a dog's breakfast. Whereas down here, we actually have, a bit of tolerance for some blue samples to be in here and some yellow samples to be in this part. And so we actually get a much nicer fit. So many solutions may fit the same observations, but some are better than others. All right, so I'm just going to step through our data assimilation. So firstly, we start off with chloride concentrations. So chloride is excluded from evapotranspiration and leaches downward into the water table. And this is kind of a proxy for recharge, hydraulic recharge. And so, we have rainfall, we have our, which is partitioned into runoff and recharge. And using that kind of partitioning relationship, we get the chloride concentration, which is a proxy for recharge. And this was published by Crosby et al. In 2018. And so these points here on the left, these indicate where we have these chloride recharge estimates. So mostly in the Sydney Basin and very, very few in the Bowen and Gunnedah Basin up further north. We also have hydraulic pressure head. So this is from the NGIS database. There's a lot of measurements, mostly in shallow aquifers, but some in the slightly more deeper aquifers as well. And there's a much greater distribution of points within the basin. And this is interesting because adjustments in the hydraulic conductivity can result in changes in the hydraulic head. So that's the level at which groundwater sits within a groundwater bore. And so depending on how deep the well intersects different aquifers or different aquitars, will essentially change the level of groundwater within that well. Yeah, so if you have two wells intersecting the same aquifer, then you would expect, and they're pretty close to each other, then you would expect them to have a similar water level within those wells. Okay. And so depending on the extent of the layer, these changes in the conductivity may affect multiple well observations. So if you change the partitioning between a high conductivity layer and a low conductivity layer, then that will change our prediction of the hydraulic level within those wells. And so integrating all of these across the whole basin kind of adequately constrains the hydraulic conductivity. And we also have temperature gradients. So temperature anomalies will be dispersed by groundwater flow from recharge to discharge. And so in the case of the Sydney Gunnedah Bowen Basin, there's quite a lot of low conductivity coal seams scattered throughout. And if you have a low conductivity layer, then that kind of bunches up the temperature gradients within that layer. And so you get, very shallow sources of high heat. And these heat flow anomalies can get dispersed by groundwater. So if you have temperature wells around this coal seam and they're showing elevated thermal gradients, then that's a pretty good indicator that you've got, I guess the kind of the wavelength of that dispersal kind of tells you a little bit about what the groundwater flow velocity is around that coal seam. Okay, and so this is the result. This is our model. It's 10 million cells. So that gives us a 6 by 6 by 0.05 kilometer resolution in the XYZ directions. And so within our inverse scheme, we actually run over 3,000 forward models to try and constrain the problem. And what I'm showing on the right here is our maximum a posteriori estimate. So this is our best model, if you like. And what we observe within this model is relatively high discharge rates off the continental shelf in the Sydney Basin. And this is up to 3 meters per day, which is pretty huge. This is like a groundwater superhighway, I would say, especially for relatively deep aquifers like this. And so we also see quite long residence times inland, so kind of west of the Great Dividing Range compared to the area east of the Great Dividing Range. So to the west, we see about 300,000 years residence times, and in the east, it's about 200 years. So those mountains are dividing the flow considerably. We also have our subsurface velocities. So here's some depth slices for our model. So we start with 0 kilometers, go up to 4 kilometers. And we can really see how intricate these flow pathways can be within our groundwater model. Generally, we find groundwater flow is highest within the permeable sediments of the Permian and Jurassic era. And so this kind of forms this kind of groundwater superhighway that stretches along here. And we also see pretty strong coastal outflow here off the continental shelf, particularly in the Sydney Basin. So the incursion of salt, seawater into groundwater aquifers in these regions are pretty limited because the outflux is so high. Whereas where the continental shelf is a bit shallower in northern Queensland, then we see maybe a slightly higher propensity for saltwater to intrude into these coastal aquifers. Yeah, and because we ran an ensemble of models, we can appraise the hydraulic conductivities, thermal conductivities, and heat productions of all these different layers within our basin. And so, this kind of encapsulates the total variation within our model space. And one of the interesting things that we looked at within this paper was by essentially comparing our groundwater flow velocity estimates for periods before the year 2000, so using data that's before 2000, and then between 2000 and 2010, and then 2010 to 2020. So we're assimilating different discrete time points within our data set. And what we actually observe is a 7-meter drop in the water table since the year 2000. This is kind of averaged across the whole basin, but we actually see drops of up to 17 meters in the productive agricultural regions of this area. And so, so 7-meter drop in the water table since 2000 and 17 meters in agricultural regions. This is kind of the Blue Mountains here. There's some Jurassic sediments and coal seams here. Now what I'm doing here is comparing streamlines. The streamlines indicate that the length indicates the residence or the distance traveled by a water droplet within an aquifer. And it's got like the trajectory, within the aquifer. So what I compared was the streamlines before the year 2000. So that's assimilating borehole data before the year 2000. And I compared that to more recent data between 2010 to 2020. And we can see that there's quite a strong departure from the pre-2000 data set in some regions, particularly in the agricultural region inland. So we find that groundwater has generally been scavenged from aquifers about 1 to 2 kilometers deep to recharge the alluvial aquifer. And so these lengthened flow pathways occur as groundwater is kind of drawn further from inland regions to kind of top up that declining water table in the agricultural regions. So yeah, water's being scavenged from the Blue Mountains further inland than it used to be. And so increasing the water extraction from these inland aquifers may permanently alter the long-range flow paths within the Sydney Gunnedah Bowen Basin. And so this is kind of some future work. Essentially, we're going to try and apply our existing workflow for the Sydney Gunnedah Bowen Basin, but then upscale that to the whole Great Artesian Basin. So this integrates new geological layers from Geoscience Australia, and they've been working hard to constrain all these undulating geometries within the basin. And yeah, we've got a postdoc working on this called Ben Knight, and he's very busy kind of wrapping all of this together. But essentially, where we have like residence times of 200,000 years within the Sydney Gunnedah Bowen Basin, we're actually seeing residence times of 1 to 2 million years within the Great Artesian Basin. So it's a much deeper basin, and it's pretty flat. So there's not a lot of topography driving these flow rates. So yeah, here's a bit of our roadmap. We want to kind of move away from these steady state models and start considering time-dependent groundwater flow models. And using the Underworld 2 infrastructure, we can actually seed tracer particles within the model to track individual water droplets. So looking at how one water droplet gets introduced into an aquifer from, say, like a mountain belt, and following its trajectory through individual aquifers until it gets discharged again. So using that, we can much more accurately constrain the residence times of groundwater flow within different aquifers. But we can also look at the mingling and mixing of different groundwaters within an aquifer system. And then we can also integrate hydraulic tracers to compare the residence times and the mixing with, like isotopic tracers that people measure in groundwater. Yeah, and then following from that, then we can start to explore the response of groundwater to tectonic forces. So this is integrating over very vast geological timescales, where very, very small changes in tilt of the Australian continent can have drastic effects on groundwater flow velocities and the distribution of recharge and discharge zones within Australia. So for instance, at the moment, Australia is kind of tilting northwards more and more as we have the Australian continent colliding with Indonesia. And so what we expect in the million-year timescale is that eventually the groundwater flow velocities will recalibrate, because the drainage will actually drain to the north of Australia, not to the south. And so only a couple of degrees maximum, maybe 1 degree, is required to actually completely shift the distribution of groundwater resources in Australia. So that's it. Thanks very much. And please follow me on Twitter.